The year 1871 was a tough year. It was dry, really dry. From the Great Lakes all the way down to the prairies, the land was thirsty. People lived differently back then. Most towns were made of wood, houses, shops, factories, everything. Forests were dense and full of trees. People cut down a lot of those trees for lumber. They used it to build new towns and cities. They used it for fuel, so there was wood everywhere. And dry wood. Summer passed and the drought stayed. Farmers saw their crops shrivel. The leaves turned brown early. The air felt heavy, like it was waiting for something to happen. Fires were not new. Small fires started all the time. A spark from a train, a cooking fire gone wrong, a lightning strike. People were used to fighting them. They had buckets and axes. They formed lines to pass water. But these fires were usually small. They burned a barn. They burned a patch of woods. They did not usually burn entire towns or vast regions. This year felt different. There was a sense of unease. People knew the danger. They saw how dry everything was. They walked through woods where the ground crunched underfoot. Rivers were low, wells were running low too. Everything was just waiting for a spark. And a strong wind. When those two things came together, it would be bad. Really bad. No one could predict how bad. No one could imagine the scale of it. They were about to learn a hard lesson about the power of nature and the vulnerability of their wooden world. This lesson would be taught in two big ways, in two different places, on the same night. The world would remember one. It would mostly forget the other, even though that other was much bigger in many ways. And so, the stage was set. For weeks, smaller fires had been burning in different places. They were like warning signs, smoke in the distance, the smell of burning wood in the air. People watched the skies. They prayed for rain, but the rain never came. Not enough anyway. The wind, though, that always came, and on Sunday, October 8th, 1871, that wind would blow with a terrible force. It would turn sparks into infernos. It would turn small fires into raging monsters. It would change lives and landscapes forever, and it would start with a dry piece of land, a wooden city, and a small town in the woods. The story of 1871 isn't just about two fires. It's about a whole region on the edge. It's about how people lived, what they built, and what they didn't understand about the land around them. They built towns with wooden houses packed tight. They left huge piles of sawdust and wood scraps around their mills. They cleared land but left behind dry brush. They lived in the middle of vast dry forests. They were surrounded by fuel, and the wind was always ready to help it burn. This was the world that would face the fires of October 1871. A world of dryness, wood, and a sudden, terrible wind. On that night, many people were going about their lives. They were finishing Sunday chores, they were getting ready for bed, they had no idea what was coming, they had no idea that the sky would soon turn red. They had no idea that the ground would burn. They had no idea that their homes, their towns, and their very lives were about to be consumed by fire. This was a time before fast news, before phones, before radio. When a fire started, it was a local problem. When fires spread, the news traveled slowly, too slowly for many people, and that slowness made the tragedy even worse. It meant help was far away. It meant warnings often came too late, and it meant that some of the worst destruction would go unnoticed by the wider world for a long time. The drought was a big player in all this. It made every leaf, every branch, every plank of wood a fire hazard. It made the ground dry and ready to burn too. Peat in the soil, tree roots, all of it became fuel. So when fire started, they didn't just burn what was on top, they burned deep down. They made a fire even harder to put out. And when the wind picked up, those fires exploded. They jumped over roads, they jumped over rivers, they created their own weather, their own winds. They became something no one had ever seen before, something truly terrifying. It was a perfect storm, but instead of rain and wind, it was fire and wind. And it would leave a mark on the land and the memory of those who lived through it. Some memories would be famous, others would be almost forgotten. Chicago was a big, fast-growing city. It was a hub for trade and transport. Many people lived there. It was a symbol of American progress. But it was also a city built almost entirely of wood. Its buildings were wood, its sidewalks were wood, its streets were sometimes paved with wood. Even the water pipes were made of wood in some places. The city was a tinderbox. It had seen fires before, small ones, medium ones. People thought they knew how to deal with them. They had a fire department, they had water, they had fire codes, even if people often ignored them. On October 8th, 1871, a fire started in a barn on DeKoven Street. The legend says Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern. That's a good story. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. No one knows for sure. What matters is that a fire started. It was Sunday night. Most people were home. The fire department was tired. They had fought a big fire the night before. They got the call about the O'Leary barn, but they went to the wrong address first. That lost time was critical. The fire spread fast. Really fast. The air was dry. The wind was blowing strong from the southwest. It pushed the flames right into the heart of the city. The buildings were close together. They were mostly wood. Fire jumped from one roof to the next. It didn't take long for whole blocks to be on fire. People woke up to the smell of smoke, then the roar of the flames. They ran from their homes. They grabbed what they could. Many left with nothing. The fire moved like a living thing. It ate through everything in its path. The city's fire department tried to stop it. They used their pumpers. They aimed hoses at the flames. But the fire was too big. The wind was too strong. Sparks flew high into the air. They landed far away and started new fires. These were called flying brands. They made the fire jump over streets, over open spaces. Soon, the waterworks were on fire. This was a disaster. Without the waterworks, there was no pressure to pump water to the hoses. The firefighters became helpless. They could only watch as the city burned. People rushed to the Chicago River. They hoped the water would protect them. Some jumped into the river to escape the heat and smoke. Others tried to cross bridges, but the bridges caught fire. The heat was so intense it could cook people alive. The river itself became a dangerous place. Boats on the river caught fire. The air was thick with smoke and burning ash. It was hard to breathe. It was hard to see. Panic set in. People pushed and shoved. They tried to get away from the fire. They tried to save their families. The fire burned all through the night. And all the next day. It stopped only when it ran out of fuel or when the wind changed. By Monday evening, it had burned itself out, leaving behind a ruined city. The scale of the destruction was huge. Over 3 square miles of the city were gone. That's about 2,000 acres. More than 17,000 buildings were destroyed. Everything in its path was just ash and rubble. The financial cost was enormous. Millions and millions of dollars. People lost their homes, their businesses, their livelihoods. About 300 people died in the Chicago fire. This number could be higher. It's hard to get an exact count when a city burns like that. Many bodies were never found or identified, but what everyone saw was the destruction of a major American city. The headlines screamed about it. The news traveled fast because Chicago was a big city. It had telegraph lines. It was important. The fire was a shock to the nation. It showed how vulnerable even the biggest cities were to fire. It became a famous event. Everyone knew about the Great Chicago Fire. They still do today. It's a powerful story of destruction and then rebuilding. Chicago rebuilt, and it rebuilt better with less wood and more brick and stone. But while Chicago burned, another, much bigger fire was raging further north, and almost no one heard about it for days. While Chicago burned brightly, catching everyone's attention, another fire was burning in the forests of Wisconsin. This fire was called the Peshtigo Fire. It happened on the very same night, October 8th, 1871. But the Peshtigo Fire was a very different kind of disaster. It was not a city fire. It was a forest fire, and it was much, much bigger. Peshtigo was a small logging town in northeastern Wisconsin. It was deep in the woods. The town was built around a large sawmill. The mill was the biggest in the Midwest. It processed millions of feet of lumber every year. The town had about 1,700 people. Around the town, there were many smaller logging camps, farms, and other settlements. The whole area was a mix of dense forests and clearings where people had built their lives. Just like Chicago, the Peshtigo area was incredibly dry. The drought had hit hard there too. The forests were like kindling. The ground was dry. There were also huge piles of sawdust and wood scraps around the sawmill. These piles had been drying out for months. They were perfect fuel for a fire. Small fires had been burning in the area for weeks, maybe even months. People were used to them. They were called swamp fires or peat fires. They often smoldered under the ground. They sent up smoke. People thought they could handle them. But on the night of October 8th, something happened that no one could have predicted. A cold front moved in, and with it came a terrible, powerful wind. This wind turned the smoldering fires into an inferno. It wasn't just a fire, it was a firestorm. The wind was so strong, and the fire so intense, that they created their own weather system. They pulled in air from all directions, creating powerful updrafts. This created whirlwinds of fire. Some people even reported seeing fire tornadoes. The fire moved with incredible speed. It moved faster than a running horse. It came out of the woods like a freight train. It hit Peshtigo and other nearby towns like a bomb. It wasn't just burning trees. It was burning the air itself. The air got so hot that it became flammable. People said the sky was on fire. The noise was deafening. A roar like 1,000 trains. The heat was unbearable. It melted glass. It turned sand into glass. Many people tried to escape by running to the Peshtigo River. They hoped the water would save them, but the fire was so hot and it moved so fast that many people died before they even reached the river. Others who made it to the river suffered terribly. The water boiled. The air above the water was searing hot. People held their children under the water, only lifting them up for a quick breath. Some drowned. Some suffocated from the smoke. Some were cooked alive by the heat, even in the river. The fire wiped out Peshtigo completely. Not a single building was left standing. But it didn't stop there. It kept going. It burned across a huge area. It hit other towns too, like Marinette, Birch Creek, Williamsville, and many smaller logging camps. Entire communities disappeared. The fire was so vast that it jumped over the Menominee River, which separates Wisconsin and Michigan, and burned parts of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan too. The death toll was staggering. At least 1,200 people died in the Peshtigo fire, maybe more. Some estimates say up to 2,500 people. It's impossible to know the exact number. Many people lived in isolated logging camps. They had no names recorded. Their bodies were never found. Or they were just ash. Entire families were wiped out. Whole communities disappeared from the map. The sheer loss of life was much greater than in Chicago. The land burned was enormous. The Peshtigo fire burned somewhere between 1.2 million and 1.5 million acres. That's a huge area. It's roughly 1,875 to 2,340 square miles. To put that in perspective, that's an area larger than the state of Rhode Island. It was a massive regional catastrophe. It consumed vast forests, farms, towns, and everything in its path. It changed the landscape for generations. The land was left barren, the soil was burned down to rock. But for days, the world didn't know about it. Communication was slow. Peshtigo was remote. Chicago was a big city with telegraph lines. The news from Chicago went out immediately. The news from Peshtigo took days to trickle out. When it did, it was overshadowed by the Chicago story. People focused on the big city fire. The devastation in the Wisconsin forests and the terrible loss of life there remained largely untold. It became a forgotten disaster, even though it was far more destructive in terms of land burned and lives lost. The Peshtigo fire was a true monster, a firestorm of unimaginable power that destroyed everything it touched over a massive area. Now, let's talk about the main question. Did the Peshtigo fire burn more land than the Great Chicago Fire? The answer is a clear yes. A very clear yes. The Great Chicago Fire, as we talked about, burned about 3 square miles of Chicago. That's roughly 2,000 acres. It was a huge loss for a city. It destroyed many buildings. It caused a lot of financial damage. It killed about 300 people. It was a terrible event. The Peshtigo fire was different. It burned between 1.2 million and 1.5 million acres. That's about 1,875 to 2,340 square miles. Do the math. The Peshtigo fire burned about 600 to 750 times more land than the Chicago fire. It wasn't even close. The Peshtigo fire was a regional inferno. The Chicago fire was a city fire. They are not really comparable in terms of land area. So for land burn, Peshtigo wins by a massive margin. What about lives lost? This is also a big difference. The Chicago fire killed about 300 people. The Peshtigo fire killed at least 1,200 people. Many historians think the number is closer to 1,500 or even 2,500. It's hard to know for sure because so many people lived in remote areas. Whole families and logging camps disappeared. No one was left to tell their story. So in terms of human lives, Peshtigo was also far deadlier. It's considered the deadliest fire in U.S. history. What about property destroyed? This is where it gets a bit tricky to compare directly. Chicago was a major city. It had expensive buildings, big businesses, and lots of infrastructure. The financial value of what burned in Chicago was enormous. Millions of dollars. Peshtigo was a logging town. It had a big sawmill, houses, and farms. The monetary value was less than Chicago's, but the Peshtigo fire also destroyed vast forests. It destroyed natural resources that would take generations to recover. It destroyed the very land itself in some places. So the nature of the destruction was different. Chicago was about urban property. Peshtigo was about towns, farms, and huge tracts of natural land. So why does everyone know about the Great Chicago Fire, and almost no one knows about the Peshtigo Fire? This is a really important question. First, Chicago was a big, important city. It was a center of commerce and news. It had telegraph lines. When it burned, the news traveled fast. It made headlines across the country and even around the world. It was a dramatic story of a city brought to its knees. People could relate to the loss of a famous city. Peshtigo, on the other hand, was a small, remote logging town. It didn't have fast communication. It took days for the news to reach the outside world, and when it did, it was competing with the Chicago story. The papers focused on Chicago. A fire in the woods, even a massive one, just wasn't as exciting or as easy to understand for most people. Second, the nature of the fires was different. In Chicago, people saw buildings burning. They saw city blocks turning to rubble. It was a very visible, tangible destruction of human-made things. In Peshtigo, it was forests, farms, and small towns that burned. The destruction of vast natural areas isn't always as easy for people to grasp as the destruction of a famous landmark or a busy city street. Third, there were fewer important people in Peshtigo to tell the story or advocate for its memory. Chicago had politicians, wealthy businessmen, and famous citizens who talked about the fire and how the city would rebuild. This kept the story alive. In Peshtigo, many of the people who might have told the story were dead. Or they were poor and had no voice. The focus was on survival and rebuilding their own lives, not on preserving the memory of the fire. And, fourth, the rebuilding effort in Chicago was inspiring. It showed the resilience of the American spirit. The city rose from the ashes stronger than before. This was a great story. Peshtigo also rebuilt, but it was a slower, harder process and a much more devastated landscape. It didn't have the same kind of grand public narrative. So, while the Peshtigo fire burned vastly more land and killed many more people, it largely faded from public memory. The Great Chicago Fire became the more famous event. It's a sad truth that sometimes the biggest tragedies are not always the ones that get remembered the most. They both happened on the same terrible night in 1871, forever linked by date, but separated by public awareness. The fires of 1871 taught some hard lessons. These lessons were about fire, about cities, and about nature. One big lesson was about how we build our towns and cities. Chicago was made of wood. Almost everything was wood. After the fire, Chicago rebuilt with new rules. They used more brick and stone. They had wider streets. They created better fire departments. This made cities safer. It showed that building materials matter. It showed that good planning can prevent disasters. It was a wake-up call for urban areas across the country. Another lesson was about forest fires. The Peshtigo fire showed the destructive power of a wildfire out of control. It showed how dry conditions, strong winds, and a lot of fuel can create an unstoppable force. People started to understand the ecology of forests better. They learned about the importance of managing forests. They learned that leaving huge piles of logging waste around settlements was dangerous. It also highlighted the need for better communication in remote areas. If people in Peshtigo had known about the scale of the danger earlier, maybe some more lives could have been saved. But they had no way to know. These fires made people think about prevention. How can we stop these things from happening? Or at least make them less deadly? It pushed for better firefighting technology and training. It pushed for more organized responses to disasters. It also made people realize how vulnerable they were to natural forces. They built big cities, they cut down huge forests, they felt powerful, but a simple spark on a dry, windy night could take it all away. The legacy of these fires is also about memory. The Chicago fire is famous. It's in history books. People talk about it. The Peshtigo fire, despite being a larger catastrophe in terms of land and lives, is largely forgotten by most people. This shows us something about how history is made and remembered. Big cities often get more attention. Dramatic stories are easier to remember. Quiet, rural tragedies can get lost, but it's important to remember both. The Peshtigo fire is a powerful reminder of nature's fury and the fragility of human life in the face of such power. It reminds us that our impact on the environment, like creating vast dry logging areas, can also make us more vulnerable. The Chicago fire is a reminder of urban vulnerability and the strength of human resilience. It shows that even after complete destruction, people can rebuild and improve. So, in conclusion, to answer the question, yes, the Peshtigo fire burned vastly more land than the Great Chicago Fire. It burned hundreds of times more land. It also killed many more people. Both fires were terrible. Both changed the places they happened, but one changed an entire landscape and the other changed a city. The fires of October 8th, 1871 stand as a stark warning from the past. They tell us to respect fire. to respect nature and to always remember the lessons learned, even from the stories that history sometimes forgets.